The truck barely had time to pull over before the lights hit. Deputy Derek Vaughn didn't know the man behind the wheel had crawled through enemy fire in Fallujah to pull 3 soldiers out of a burning vehicle. No. He'd stood at attention while a 4-star general pinned the nation's highest military honor to his chest. All Vaughn saw was a big black man in a pickup truck driving slowly through a neighborhood where, in his words, he didn't belong. Within 60 seconds, Elias Carter was slammed into the hood of a police cruiser, wrists wrenched behind his back, cheek pressed against hot metal, while Deputy Vaughn sneered into his ear. Big, black, and dangerous. That's all I need to see. Vaughn had no idea what he had just done. Before you find out what happens next, subscribe to this channel. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Let's go. 5. The drive back from Riverside should have taken 22 minutes. As Carter knew, because he'd made it 100 times down. Route 9 left at the Sunoco, through the oak-lined stretch of Millbrook Road that cut through the eastern edge of Ashford Hills, North Carolina, where the neighborhoods got quieter and the houses got bigger and the lawns got greener and the welcome got colder. He didn't think about that part much anymore. He'd grown up 40 minutes east in a town called Denton where nobody had a lawn worth mentioning, and he'd spent enough years in places far more hostile than Ashford Hills to develop what his mother used to call a talent for ignoring nonsense. It was just past 7 in the evening. The summer sky had gone that particular shade of orange-gray that meant the heat wasn't done with you yet, just resting. Elias had the windows down, one arm resting on the door, the radio on low, some old Marvin Gaye his mother had loved. His truck was a 2019 Ford N50, charcoal gray clean. No bumper stickers. Registration current, insurance paid through December. He'd checked the tires 2 weekends ago. He was thinking about Marcus Webb. Marcus was 16, skinny, quick with a joke, and the fastest mental math student Elias had seen in 4 years of running the mentorship program at Riverside Youth Center. Marcus had stayed after the session ended to show Elias a problem he'd worked out on his own, a geometry-proof 3 pages handwritten with an apology scrawled at the top that said, "Sorry if this is wrong." It wasn't wrong. It was nearly perfect. Les had told him so. And Marcus had looked at the floor and said, "Nobody ever told me I was good at stuff like this before." Elias was still sitting with that sentence when he noticed the cruiser in his rearview mirror. It had come off a side street, Larimer Avenue, a quiet residential offshoot, and slid in behind him without urgency. Elias glanced at his speedometer, 27 miles per hour in a 30 zone. His hands were at 10 and 2. He waited. The lights came on anyway. He pulled over immediately onto the gravel shoulder where Millbrook Road widened near the old stone fence. He turned off the engine, put both hands on the top of the steering wheel where they were visible, and waited. This part he also knew. He'd been through it before. Not here, not exactly, but variations. That the process was familiar in a way it shouldn't have been, in a way that sat low and heavy in his chest, but he kept his face calm and his hands still. The deputy took his time getting out of the cruiser. When he finally approached, he came up on the driver's side and stopped just behind the door from a position that forced Elias to turn his head awkwardly to see him. The man was mid-30s, broad across the shoulders, with a thick jaw, and the kind of expression that had decided something before it started. "License and registration," he said. No greeting. Evening. Officer Elias reached slowly for the glove box. "My registration is in the glove compartment. I'm going to open it now. I can see what you're doing." Elias handed over both documents without comment. The deputy's name tag read Vaughn D. Took them and stood there for a moment, looking at them without looking at them the way some officers did when they were buying time to think of something else to say. "Where are you coming from?" "Riverside Youth Center. I run a mentorship program there on Tuesday evenings." Vaughn's eyes went to the truck bed, where a folding table and 2 storage bins were visible under a tarp. What's in those bins? "Materials, workbooks, some basic supplies." "I've been running the program for 4 years. Mind if I take a look?" Elias kept his voice level. "Am I being detained, deputy?" Vaughn's jaw shifted. "I'm asking a simple question." "I'm asking a simple one back." "I provided my documents." I wasn't speeding. Like to understand the basis for the stop before we go any further." The temperature between them dropped about 10 degrees. "You were driving erratically," Vaughn said. "I was driving 27 in a 30 zone. That's your claim." "That's what the road looks like," Elias said. "My dash cam will confirm it." That landed. Vaughn's eyes went briefly to the small camera mounted on Elias's windshield, then came back to Elias's face with something harder in them. He handed the license and registration back. Without a word, went to his cruiser, sat for 4 minutes. Elias watched the clock on his dashboard, 4 minutes and 12 seconds. When Vaughn came back, he had a different energy, slower, more deliberate. He'd made a decision. Step out of the vehicle. What is the reason? Step out of the vehicle, sir. The sir came out like a splinter. Elias opened the door and stepped out. He was 6'2", broad-shouldered, wearing dark slacks and a gray button-down shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbow. He stood straight, hands visible at his sides, and looked at Vaughn directly. Is there a problem I should know about? I smell marijuana. The words dropped into the evening air like a stone into still water. Elias felt the shift happen in his chest, that particular cold clarity that used to come over him in the seconds before something went wrong in a place where wrong could mean dead. He breathed through it. Deputy, there is no marijuana in this vehicle or on my person. I'm going to need you to step to the rear of your vehicle. The rear of the vehicle. Now Elias walked to the back of the truck. On followed. Then moved past him to the tailgate, lowered it without asking, and reached under the tarp. He pulled out one of the storage bins and dropped it onto the tailgate with a crash that sent papers and workbooks sliding across the metal surface. A stack of manila folders caught the evening air and scattered across the gravel. Elias watched his work land in the dirt. He said nothing. Dug through the second bin with the same indifference. Pencils, a ruler, a laptop sleeve, a box of granola bars. Elias kept for kids who came in having skipped dinner. He held up the laptop sleeve, unzipped it. Found nothing. Upped it. Elias's voice was quiet. Controlled those materials belonged to the youth program. Some of those papers took kids weeks to complete. Didn't look at him. He was pulling the tarp aside to check the truck bed beyond. If you've got nothing to hide, you've got nothing to worry about. The sentence was a wall. Elias had heard it before. It was designed to end a conversation, not participate in one. He bent down and began picking up the scattered folders from the gravel. His jaw was tight, but his hands were steady. After 3 more minutes of searching the cab, under the seats, the center console, which Vaughn opened without asking the deputy, came up empty. He stood at the side of the truck with his hands on his hips and said nothing for a moment, recalculating. Then his eyes went to the item hanging from Elias's rearview mirror. It wasn't hung to display. Elias kept it in the truck, because he'd never quite figured out where else to put something like that, too meaningful to be in a drawer, too significant to be left on a shelf at home. It was a small blue case on a thin ribbon, and the case held a medal. He rarely thought about it anymore. It was just there, the way some things became part of the furniture of a life. Leaned into the cab and lifted it off the mirror without asking. What's this? Don't. Elias caught himself. That belongs to me. Please don't handle it. Vaughn turned the case over in his hands, flipped it open. Inside, on a field of pale blue fabric, sat the Medal of Honor, the 5-pointed star on its pale blue ribbon, the Minerva head at its center, the detail work worn smooth by years, but unmistakable to anyone who knew what they were looking at. Clearly didn't know what he was looking at. Maybe he did and chose to respond the way he did anyway. Medallion. He held it up to the fading light with the casual contempt of someone examining a piece of junk from a flea market. His craftsmanship. The silence that followed was the kind that had weight to it. Elias looked at the medal in the man's hand. He thought of the hillside in Helmand Province. He thought of the smoke and the weight and the sound of someone screaming his name. He thought of 3 men who had been alive because of choices he made in 30 seconds of chaos. And he thought of the ceremony afterward, the Eastern Room of the White House, Marcus Reed in his dress uniform. The president's hand on his shoulder, the specific stillness of that moment. That is the Medal of Honor, Elias said. His voice was absolutely flat. Was awarded by the President of the United States. Please return it to me. Vaughn set the case on the hood of the truck. Handed back. Set down like a receipt. I'm going to need you to put your hands behind your back. On what charge? Resisting. I did not resist. You questioned a lawful order multiple times, and you failed to comply in a timely manner. Vaughn was already reaching for his cuffs. Around. This was the moment Elias recognized it, the way he recognized certain kinds of terrain. The point at which the ground changes under you, and every choice has a consequence. He could push back further. He could cite the law, which he knew well, better than Vaughn clearly did. He could tell the deputy exactly what failure to return that medal constituted legally and what the next 24 hours of his career would look like. Instead, he turned around and put his hands behind his back. Because he was not going to give Derek Vaughn a single additional thing to work with. Not one word. Not one movement. Not one fraction of a moment that could be narrated differently later. The cuffs clicked into place. Vaughn's hand landed on Elias's shoulder and steered him toward the cruiser with the kind of force that wasn't necessary and knew it. The car's hood was still warm from the engine when Elias's cheek came in contact with it, not slammed but pressed with enough deliberateness to make the point. One of Vaughn's knees came up against the back of Elias's leg, pinning him there while the deputy keyed his radio and called it in. Dispatch, this is Vaughn. I've got a 1015 on Millbrook Road. Black, 6'2", approximately 40, having a gray F-150. Possible narcotics. Resisting going to need a unit. Elias pressed his lips together. His heart rate was slower than it had any business being. That was the training years of it. A decade and a half of learning to find the cold center of a situation and stay there while everything outside burned. He found it now. He also processed what he was going to do next. There was one call he could make. He hadn't used it in years, hadn't wanted to operate that way. Never liked the idea of pulling rank by proxy, of solving problems with names instead of arguments. But there was a version of tonight that ended badly for reasons that had nothing to do with him, and Marcus Webb needed him to show up next Tuesday, and the 37 other kids in the Riverside program needed him to show up, and the stack of papers now gathering dust on the gravel of Millbrook Road needed to be sorted and filed and used because those kids had worked hard on them. He made the calculation. When Vaughn finished his radio call and stepped back slightly, Elias turned his head and said quietly, "I need to make a phone call." Didn't look at him. "You'll get your call at the station." "I'm aware of that. I'm requesting to make a brief call now as I have the right to do." "That's not, I won't argue with you about the law, deputy. I'm making a respectful request, one call." Vaughn studied him for a long moment with the expression of a man trying to figure out whether something was a threat. He took the phone from Elias's shirt pocket and held it up. Pocket. Thumbprint. "You'll need to hold it up," Vaughn did, with barely concealed irritation. Elias nodded toward the contact labeled Reed M. That one. Vaughn's eyes narrowed at the contact name. He held the phone to his own ear for a moment, as if expecting to catch something. Then he made a sound, half a laugh, disbelieving, and held it to Elias's ear without a word. Elias rang twice. Elias. The voice that answered was familiar in the way that bedrock was familiar, solid, immediate, carrying the weight of someone accustomed to being the person a situation stopped and reorganized itself around. "All right." "Not entirely, sir. I'm on Millbrook Road in Ashford Hills. I've been stopped and detained by a county deputy. I'm in cuffs." "Not a long one. Are you hurt?" "Sir." "What's the deputy's name?" Elias turned his head slightly toward the badge. "Derek Vaughn, Ashford Hills County Sheriff's Office." Another pause, shorter this time. When General Marcus Reed spoke again, his voice had changed in a way that was barely perceptible, and immediately clarifying the way a sky changes a half-second before the weather does. "I'll be there." "Keep your head always, sir." Vaughn ended the call himself, pocketing the phone with a small snort. "Kind of yours." An old colleague, Elias said. The second cruiser arrived 6 minutes later, a younger deputy named Prosser, mid-20s, who took one look at the situation and settled into the background, the way junior people do when they sense they've arrived at something they don't want to be too visible in. He helped Vaughn load Elias into the back of the cruiser without making eye contact with either of them. Vaughn picked up the metal case from the hood of the truck and dropped it into a small paper evidence bag, as if it were a bottle cap. Elias watched it disappear into the bag. He didn't say anything. He sat in the back of the cruiser with his wrists in cuffs behind him, back straight, face composed, and he watched the Millbrook Road gravel disappear through the rear window as Vaughn pulled out onto the road and drove toward the Ashford Hills County Sheriff's Office on Dunmore Street. Took 9 minutes. The station was a low beige building with a flag out front and a parking lot that needed resurfacing. Walked Elias in through the side entrance, past a processing area where a desk clerk looked up and then looked back down, past a bulletin board with outdated notices, a holding area with 4 chairs bolted to the wall and a fluorescent light that hummed 2 tones flat. "Nice." "Sit," Vaughn said. Sat. Vaughn disappeared, and for a while the room was just the fluorescent hum and the faint sound of the dispatch radio from somewhere down the hall. On the wall read 7:41 p.m. Elias sat with the particular stillness of someone who knew how to wait, not passive, not resigned, but present. I counted. For his mind was working clearly. He thought about the dash cam footage in the truck, which was recording on a loop and would have captured everything from the stop onward. He thought about the fact that Vaughn's body camera had been visible on his vest, which meant there was footage from that direction too. He thought about the scattered papers on the gravel of Millbrook Road and made a mental note to call the center director, Patricia Osei, in the morning, to let her know the materials might need to be replaced. He thought about General Marcus Reed, and what it meant that the man had said, "I'll be there," without asking a single question about whether it was worth his time. Reappeared 20 minutes later with a clipboard. "I'm going to need to process you. Full name Elias James Carter. Birth March 14th, 1979. Vaughn wrote it down. Occupation: retired United States Marine Corps. Currently running a nonprofit mentorship program. Pause in the writing. Not a long one. Rank: when you retired. Elias looked at him steadily. Master Sergeant Vaughn wrote it down without expression. 5. He finished the form, slid it across, sign at the bottom. To speak to a lawyer first. You'll have access to a phone shortly. I have the right to speak to counsel before signing anything. On took the clipboard back. He was quiet for a moment, the particular quiet of someone recalibrating, and then he left again. Clock on the wall read 8:03 p.m. Elias waited. At 8:17, the sound of the front entrance of the station changed. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was the specific acoustic event of a door opening and a presence entering a space, and the subsequent muffling of all the ambient sounds in that space, as the people in it registered that something had arrived that required their full attention. Through the holding area's small reinforced window, Elias could see the front desk clearly. He watched the desk clerk's face go from routine to uncertain to something else entirely. He watched Deputy Prosser, who had been standing near the water cooler, straighten involuntarily. He watched the door at the end of the hall, Vaughn's office, open a crack as the deputy inside tried to see what was happening without making himself visible. And then through the glass, Elias Carter watched General Marcus Reed walk into the Ashford Hills County Sheriff's Office in his full-dress uniform, 4 stars on each shoulder, his service ribbons aligned in the precise geometry of a military life. His posture carrying the particular gravity of a man who had operated at the highest levels of American military command for 31 years and had never once doubted his right to be in any room he chose to enter. Was 63, broad across the chest, silver-haired, and he walked with a deliberateness that made the floor seem to recognize him. He was accompanied by a younger officer in uniform, a colonel from the insignia, and a woman in a dark blazer who carried a briefcase and moved with the efficiency of someone who billed by the minute. Reed stopped at the front desk. His voice was clear, carrying, and entirely without urgency. I'm here for Master Sergeant Elias Carter. Please tell me who is in command of this facility tonight. The desk clerk's mouth moved without sound for a moment. That would be Deputy Sergeant Holloway. Sir, he's Aikens. Get him, please. Holloway emerged from a back office, still pulling his jacket on. He was 50-ish heavyset, with the expression of a man who had seen his share of difficult nights at this desk and had just realized this was going to be a different category of difficult entirely. He looked at the 4 stars, looked at the colonel, looked at the woman with the briefcase, and visibly processed a sequence of realizations in about 3 seconds. He started, where is Master Sergeant Carter? The question landed like a block of concrete. Holloway turned toward the hallway. His voice, when he called for Vaughn, had lost about half its authority. The holding area door opened. Elias stood up. He walked out, still uncuffed from the processing. Vaughn had been particular about that. This insisted restraint through the whole intake process. He saw Reed across the room before Reed saw him. And what he registered in that first instant wasn't relief or gratitude, or even the particular warmth of seeing someone who had known you at your best moment. What he registered was the general's face when Reed turned and saw the cuffs, and the single controlled breath Reed took in response, and the way Reed's chin lifted slightly, the way it always did when he was deciding something. Left the room. He stopped in front of Elias. And then in the holding area doorway of the Ashford Hills County Sheriff's Office on Dunmore Street, in front of Deputy, who had spent an hour treating a man like a problem to be managed, in front of a clerk who hadn't moved from her desk, of a colonel and an attorney, and a deputy sergeant who was rapidly reconsidering every choice he'd made in the last 20 minutes. General Marcus Reed, 4 stars, 31 years of service, came to attention and offered a full, formal military salute to the man in handcuffs in front of him. The gesture lasted 4 seconds. It was the most precise 4 seconds in the room. Reed's voice, when he spoke, was quiet enough that only the people immediately present could hear it, and hard enough to cut glass. Who is responsible for this? Nobody in the room moved to answer. In the corner near the processing desk, Derek Vaughn had gone very still. Nobody answered, because nobody could figure out who was supposed to answer first. Holloway opened his mouth, closed it. His eyes went to Vaughn, who was standing near the protsing desk with his arms at his sides, and the particular stillness of a man who had just watched the floor drop out from under. Everything he thought he understood about tonight. Vaughn's jaw was working slightly, the way jaws do when the brain is running fast and the mouth hasn't caught up. Reed didn't look at either of them. He was looking at the cuffs on Elias's wrists. "Life. Remove those," he said. Holloway moved first, not Vaughn, which was its own statement. "Life." The deputy sergeant crossed the room with his keys already out, and the cuffs came off with a mechanical click that seemed louder than it should have. Elias brought his hands forward, rubbed his right wrist once with his left thumb. Not performance, just reflex, and straightened. Reed watched when Elias met his eyes. The general gave him a single brief nod that carried a full conversation inside it. "Elias, CC you held. We'll sort the recist." Elias had known the man for 17 years and could read him the way you learned to read Weatherwick in the field, not perfectly, but accurately enough when it mattered. "Thank you. Don't thank me yet." Reed turned. The attorney whose Elias would later learn was named Sandra Fitch, and who represented a firm out of Raleigh that handled federal civil rights cases. With a record that made prosecutors nervous, had already set her briefcase on the front counter and was opening it with the focused efficiency of time, someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment. The Colonel Elias recognized him now. James Devereaux, Reed's aide-de-camp. For the last 2 years, stood slightly to the side, taking in the room with the same assessment eyes that good officers developed early and kept forever. Holloway had found his voice, but not quite his authority. "I want to assure you that this is an active situation, and we take seriously, Sergeant." Reed's tone wasn't raised. It didn't need to be. I've spent 31 years being assured by a people who hadn't earned the right to assure me of anything. You'll save us both time if you simply tell me where Master Sergeant Carter's property is, including a blue metal case that was removed from his vehicle. Holloway looked at Vaughn. Vaughn was the one who moved to the evidence shelf. He lifted the small paper bag with a deliberateness that suggested he was trying to perform competence and knew it wasn't reading. He set it on the desk. Reed didn't touch it. Fitch did. She documented it with her phone before Holloway could say anything about chain of custody, and her expression made clear she understood chain of custody better than anyone in the room. "I'll need that returned to my client directly," Fitch said. Holloway repeated Elias Carter. "Yes." She said it the way you'd say obviously without using the word. Set the bag in front of Elias. Elias opened it. Knock out the case. Open the case. Check the metal, a habit. Not paranoia. Because the clasp on the back had a small dent from the day it was made, and he knew exactly where that dent sat and then closed it and held it in his hand. He looked at Vaughn. Vaughn looked back. Something crossed the deputy's face in that moment that wasn't quite readable. It moved through too fast, and then he looked away first. Fitch was already speaking to Holloway in a low, quick voice, walking him through the immediate situation with the precision of someone laying out tools before surgery. Elias caught fragments on probable cause for the stop. No controlled substance recovered. No basis for the resisting charge. Body camera footage. And that was the word that finally moved Vaughn. Body camera, Vaughn said. He'd stepped slightly forward without seeming to realize it. The camera had a malfunction tonight. "I filed." The deputy Fitch didn't look up from her paperwork. The single word landed in the room, and Vaughn went quiet. Fitch did look up then. "We have footage from Master Sergeant Carter's dash cam." "We have footage from the patrol car's front-facing camera." "I'll address your body camera separately." She paused, and the pause was the kind that lawyers deploy like a weapon. Holloway made a decision in that moment. Elias could see it happen. Could see the deputy sergeant calculate his options and recognize that the column of numbers on the side of Protect Vaughn was significantly shorter than the column on the other side. Holloway turned to Vaughn and said in a voice that had dropped and flattened considerably, "Derek, my office." Vaughn followed him. The door didn't slam, which was almost worse. Elias sat in the small conference room adjacent to the processing area, the kind of room that existed in every municipal building, and a table that wobbled if you leaned wrong, and chairs that had been bought in bulk sometime around 2009. Devereaux stood near the door. Fitch was down the hall with Holloway, which was where Elias wanted her to be. "You could have told them who you were when it started," Reed said. Not a criticism. Just a fact he was examining. "I know." Elias turned the metal case over in his hands. But that's not the point I wanted to make." "What point did you want to make? That it shouldn't matter?" Was quiet for a moment. He was sitting with his elbows on the table slightly forward, the way he sat when he was actually listening rather than waiting to talk. It was one of the things that had made him good at his job. It shouldn't, he said finally, but you knew it would get you out faster. Yes. So you chose the longer road, I chose the honest road, Elias said, lying. You wasn't about rank, it was about documentation. I needed someone to witness this who they couldn't dismiss. I did him. You thought that through in the back of a patrol car. I had 9 minutes in the car and 20 more in that room. Yes, I thought about a few things. Elias set the case flat on the table in front of him. Athens. How's Margaret Reed's expression shifted slightly, the small involuntary softening that his wife's name always produced in him, even when he was actively trying to be stone. She's well sends her regards. She'd have been here herself if she'd known. God help Vaughn, if she had been. For the first time since he'd walked into the station, Reed smiled. It was small and fast and completely genuine. Then it was gone because Fitch appeared in the doorway. The charges are being dropped, she said, effective now. Holloway signed off. He's not happy, but he's signing, she paused. Vaughn is still in the office. Holloway told him to stay put while they figure out what to say publicly. What are they planning to say publicly, Reed asked. That's what I'm about to go find out. She looked at Elias. Cam footage. You said it was recording. Yes. It loops every 4 hours. The stop was at he checked the clock on the wall. 5. Approximately 7:20. We've got plenty of time on the loop. 9. I'm going to want that footage tonight. Can you authorize remote access to your camera account? Already have it set up. I can pull it from my phone. She allowed herself one brief satisfied expression before the professional mask came back. 5. Good, one more thing. She looked between both of them, settling on Elias. When you walk out of this building tonight, say nothing to anyone outside this room about what happened until I've had a chance to review everything. Social media. Not friends, not a text message. Nothing. I'm serious, Elias. This is the part where people undo good cases. I understand. He said again, I've been careful so far. Left. Reed was looking at him in a particular way. Nice. She's good, the general said. She should be recommended her. I recommended her because she's the best civil rights attorney in the state. Reed leaned back. I recommended her because I've been watching your program for 2 years and thinking about what happens the day something like this occurs, because the odds that it wouldn't were never in your favor on those roads. He paused. I'm sorry. It took this long for me to be right. Elias looked at him. You don't need to apologize for anything, sir. I know I don't need to. Voice was blunt but not unkind. I'm doing it anyway. They were outside by 9:10. The evening air was still warm, carrying the particular end-of-summer smell of cut grass and distant rain, and Elias stood on the sidewalk in front of the Ashford Hills County Sheriff's Office while Devereaux pulled Reed's vehicle around. Fitch was still inside. She'd be inside for another hour at least, and she'd told Elias to go home and get some sleep, which he planned to do as soon as he retrieved his truck from Millbrook Road. Reed stood beside him on the sidewalk. There's going to be noise about this, the general said. I know. They'll want to make it about rank, about me showing up in uniform. Say, the only reason you walked out tonight is the 4 stars. Some people will say that, Elias agreed. Does that bother you? Elias considered it for real, not as a rhetorical question. What bothers me is that they might be right. That, without the call, without you, walking in there, I don't know how tonight ends. Maybe it ends with a night in a cell and a charge that costs me months and money to fight. Maybe it ends differently and worse. He stopped. That's what I keep coming back to. Tonight. Specifically, the version of tonight where I'm not someone who can call a 4-star general. Reed said nothing. Because there are 1,000 versions of this, Elias said. 5 every single day. And most of them don't end in a parking lot with a handshake. 5. They stood in silence for a moment somewhere down Dunmore Street. A car alarm went off and then stopped. What do you want to do? Reed asked. I want to go pick up my truck, Elias said. And then I want to figure out what Vaughn's record looks like, because I can't believe tonight is the first time he's done this. Sideways. That's not the answer of a man who wants to put this behind him. Oh, Elias agreed. It's not. The truck was where he'd left it, pulled onto the gravel shoulder of Millbrook Road. The tarp over the truck bed had come loose. Vaughn had replaced it carelessly after the search, and one of the storage bins had tipped, scattering more materials across the bed. Elias stood at the tailgate in the dark with his phone flashlight on and gathered everything by hand. 5. Some of the papers were damp from the evening air. A few were torn where the gravel had caught them. One of them he recognized when he turned it over was Marcus Webb's geometry proof. The paper was crumpled and the bottom corner had torn clean off. The apology at the top, sorry if this is wrong, was smeared slightly from where the edge had caught moisture. Elias stood there for a moment, holding it. Then he folded it carefully and put it in his shirt pocket. He got into the truck, sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine, and let himself be quiet for about 2 full minutes. 5. Just that quiet in the dark on a road in Ashford Hills where he apparently didn't belong, as his hands rested on the steering wheel. 5. His chest felt tight in a way that had been building since the cuffs went on, and that he hadn't allowed himself to acknowledge until right now. Because there are things you put away in the moment, so you can function in the moment, and you deal with them later when the doors are closed, and there's no one watching. 5. He thought about his mother, Dorinda Carter, who had worked second shift at a textile plant in Denton for 22 years to keep them in shoes and pay the electricity bill. 5. And who had cried when he deployed for the first time and again when he came home, and who had died of a cardiac event 4 years ago in a hospital room that was too far from their old neighborhood for most of her friends to visit easily. 5. She had believed in him in that particular unspectacular way that required no audience. She'd never made a speech about it. She'd just showed up. 5. He thought about what it meant to show up. He started the truck and drove home. Thursday morning, Sandra Fitch had the dashcam footage, the patrol car footage, and a preliminary copy of the incident report that Vaughn had filed, and the incident report was its own kind of revelation. Elias sat at his kitchen table with a mug of coffee reading the summary. Fitch had emailed him at 6:47 a.m. with a note at the top that said, "Read this and then call me back." According to Vaughn's report, the stop had been initiated because the subject vehicle was traveling erratically and at an inconsistent speed. The officer had detected the odor of a controlled substance upon approaching the vehicle. 5. Subject had been uncooperative and combative during the investigation and had refused to comply with lawful instructions on multiple occasions, necessitating restraint. The search of the vehicle had been conducted pursuant to the suspected controlled substance. No controlled substance had been recovered, but the subject's combative behavior and failure to comply constitute resisting a lawful search and obstruction. In the report, Elias Carter was referred to throughout as the subject, by name. Not as Mr. Carter, the subject. He read it twice. Then he called Fitch. "I've read it," he said when she picked up. 5. "Good, now listen carefully." Her voice was in the same register. It had been at the station, cool, precise, the voice of someone who saved emotion for places it did useful work. The dashcam footage contradicts every material claim in that report. Your speed is consistent throughout. There is no detectable basis for the stop on camera. Your behavior during the search is measurably compliant. Every instruction you received, you followed. 5. The report describes a completely different encounter than the one recorded. Elias. He wrote a false report. Elias said he wrote a false report. Fitch confirmed. Elias set his mug down on the table. Something had gone cold in his chest, not anger exactly, but the crystallization of it. Anger moving from feeling into something structural. How many people do you think he's done this to? That's exactly the right question. A pause. Asked. I've been pulling public records since last night. Traffic. Stop data, complaint records, civil case filings against the department. Has been cited internally twice in 3 years for complaints related to conduct during stops. 5. Both complaints were reviewed and closed without action. Closed. By who the complaints went through the standard internal review process. Signed off at the sheriff level. Elias was quiet for a moment. Sheriff Mercer, yes. He sat with that outside his kitchen window. A crow had landed on the fence post at the edge of his yard and was inspecting the ground with the patient systematic focus that crows brought to everything. Watched it for a moment. What are the 2 complaints about? One was filed by a man named Terrence Okafor. Stopped on Route 9 about 18 months ago. Searched his vehicle without consent, filed a report claiming the search was consensual, and cited him for a minor traffic violation that the DA's office later declined to prosecute. Okafor filed the complaint. It was investigated internally and closed with a note that Vaughn's account was consistent with standard procedure. Fitch paused. Second was filed by a woman named Dara Simmons. Stopped in the Millbrook Road area, same stretch where he stopped you 14 months ago. Or pattern. Vehicle searched, report filed with no notation of the search's basis. Complaint filed, complaint closed. And both of them. Both, Black, Fitch said. She wasn't reading from anything. She'd already processed it. I haven't found a record of a complaint from a white driver against Vaughn. But that doesn't mean there isn't one. It means I haven't found it. Elias looked at the crow on his fence post. It had found something and was now protecting it from an invisible threat, its wings slightly raised. What do we need to do? He asked. I'm filing a federal civil rights complaint this morning. 1983 unlawful seizure, 4th Amendment violation, fabrication of evidence. I'm also notifying the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, because the pattern I'm seeing is sufficient to trigger a pattern practice inquiry. She paused again. Elias, I need to be direct with you. This is going to grow beyond one incident and one officer. The documentation trail runs through that sheriff's office in a way that's going to implicate the institutional structure. That means publicity. It means attention you may not want. I don't particularly want attention, he said, but I want this to stop. Those two things are going to be hard to separate. I know. He stood up from the table and took his mug to the sink. Do what you need to do, Sandra. A story broke. On Friday afternoon, Elias didn't break it. He had honored his agreement with Fitch, kept his phone down, and his accounts quiet for 48 hours. Someone inside the Ashford Hills County Sheriff's Office had not kept quiet later. It would emerge that Deputy Prosser, the young officer who'd stood in the background during the arrest, had sent a text to a friend who worked at the Ashford Register, and that text had included enough specifics to send a reporter to the right sources inside of a day. Register. Ran it at 2 p.m. Marine Veteran Medal of Honor recipient arrested during traffic stop in Ashford Hills. 4 p.m. it had been picked up by the Associated Press. 6 p.m. Elias's phone, which Fitch had told him not to answer for calls he didn't recognize, and he was rigidly following, had received more than 200 calls from numbers he didn't recognize. He was sitting in his living room when Patricia Osei, the Riverside Youth Center director, called from a number he did recognize. He answered. Her voice was tight with something that wasn't quite distress, but was close. So, are you watching the news? No, turn it on. He found the local station in time to catch the last 40 seconds of a segment that featured the dashcam footage. Fitch had authorized its release through proper channels that afternoon, and specifically the sequence in which Vaughn leaned into it. The truck lifted the metal case and held it up to the light with the expression of a man handling something he'd found in a gutter. The anchor cut back from the footage with a particular kind of careful tone that local news used when a story had already outrun their ability to minimize it. County Sheriff Caleb Mercer has released a statement saying the department is reviewing the incident and takes all allegations of misconduct seriously. They reviewed his complaints twice before and found nothing, Patricia said. The parents at the center have been calling me all afternoon. Her voice shifted slightly. The kids know Elias Marcus Webb's mother called me. He saw the footage. Something moved through Elias's chest that he didn't quite have a name for. How was he? She said he watched it twice and then didn't say anything for about 20 minutes. And then he asked her if you were okay. Elias closed his eyes for a moment. Asked her to tell him. I'm okay, he said. I will. Patricia paused. You know what he also asked? What? He asked if this is what you meant when you told them that staying calm was a form of power. The room was quiet. Elias sat with that for a long time. After Patricia hung up long enough that the news segment cycled through and came back around longer than that, the daylight in his living room went from gold to gray, and the street outside settled into the particular evening hush of a residential block, where everyone was indoors watching the same footage he'd been part of, all of them, forming opinions about it, most of them never having stood on a gravel shoulder on Millbrook Road with their hands on a steering wheel, trying to make choices that had no clean options. He didn't feel like a symbol. He felt tired. He felt the specific concrete exhaustion of having spent 3 days being careful. Careful in the truck, careful in the cuffs, careful on the sidewalk, careful in every call and email and conversation since, because carelessness had consequences. He couldn't afford and other people couldn't afford either. He felt the tight-shouldered weariness of a man who had been performing competence and calm for an audience sniffed for, and who now sat alone in his living room with no audience to perform for, and still couldn't quite figure out how to stop. He got up and heated the leftover soup from 2 nights ago. He ate it standing at the kitchen counter, and then his phone rang with a number he did recognize, a Washington, D.C. area code, a specific exchange, and when he answered, the voice on the other end was not Marcus Reed, but was someone in Reed's chain of communication, and what that voice told him in the careful lives. Official language of institutions that had begun to understand the size of what was about to happen was that the Department of Justice had already made contact with the Ashford Hills County Sheriff's Office to request documentation to demand it. The call lasted 4 minutes. When it ended, Elias set his phone on the counter next to the empty soup bowl and stood very still looking at the kitchen window, where his reflection floated transparent against the dark outside. He thought of Derek Vaughn's face in the evidence room, the way Vaughn's eyes had moved away first. He thought of Terrence Okafor and Dara Simmons, whose names were in complaint files that had been closed without action, whose stories had been reviewed by a system that decided they weren't worth the trouble. He thought of Marcus Webb sitting silent for 20 minutes before asking if he was okay. And somewhere in the Ashford Hills County Sheriff's Office, A document request from the Department of Justice was sitting on Sheriff Caleb Mercer's desk. Not a suggestion, not an inquiry, but a federal demand, and Mercer was staring at it right now, understanding for the first time that the decision to close those complaints hadn't just been a mistake. It had been a record. And that record, as Mercer was about to discover, had a very long memory. Document. Demand from the Department of Justice arrived officially on Friday evening, a formal letter on DOJ letterhead, addressed to Sheriff Caleb Mercer, Ashford Hills County Sheriff's Office, requesting the immediate preservation and production of all traffic stop records, internal complaint files, body camera logs, dashcam archives, and officer conduct reports from the preceding 5 years. Language was precise and unambiguous. It used the phrase pattern or practice twice in the first paragraph, which was the kind of phrasing that didn't appear in routine correspondence. It appeared when the federal government had already looked at something and decided it didn't like the shape of it. Mercer called his department's legal counsel at 7:15 p.m. The call lasted 22 minutes, and by the end of it, Mercer had gone from defensive to quiet in a way that his counsel, a county attorney named Bertrand Holt, who had worked with the department for 9 years, found more alarming than the defensiveness. It meant the sheriff had done the math. Elias didn't know the specifics of that call. He knew, because Fitch told him Saturday morning, was that the sheriff's office had retained outside criminal defense counsel by 8 o'clock Friday night, which was not the behavior of an institution that believed it had done nothing wrong. They're circling the wagons, Fitch said. She was in his kitchen this time. She'd driven from Raleigh because the situation had progressed to the point where phone calls weren't the right tool anymore. She sat across from him at the kitchen table with her laptop open and 2 legal pads covered in handwriting that only she could probably read. They'll cooperate with the document request, because they have to. But they'll produce as little as possible for as long as possible while their attorneys figure out what's in the files and how bad it is. How bad is it? Elias asked. I think it's bad, she said it without drama, the way a doctor gives you a number and lets you do the emotional work on your own time. I've found 3 additional traffic stops in the public data that match the pattern. Same stretch of road, same demographic complaints, either not formally filed or filed and buried. And that's just what's findable without subpoena power. DOJ is subpoena power. Elias turned his coffee mug in his hands. The morning was overcast, the kitchen gray-lit and still. Does the next week look like? She said. There are 4 national media outlets that have already contacted my office for comment. I've told them nothing. There's a civil rights organization out of Charlotte, the Alderman Coalition, that called last night wanting to hold a press conference on your behalf. She paused, watching him. I told them I'd pass it along. What do you think? I think a press conference right now helps them more than it helps you. The story is already running. What you need is for the legal process to work, not for the legal process to compete with a media narrative. She picked up her pen, tapped it once on the pad. But it's your call, tell them I appreciate it, Elias said, and that I'll be in touch. Fitch nodded, wrote something. There's one more thing. He waited Deputy Processor, the younger officer who responded to the scene on Millbrook Road. He called my office yesterday. She looked at him directly. Wants to make a statement, a voluntary one. Says he witnessed the search, witnessed Vaughn handling the metal, and he has information about Vaughn's conduct on previous stops, that he was his word instructed not to document. The kitchen was very quiet. Instructed by who, Elias asked. He didn't say on the call he wants to meet in person. Fitch set her pen down. He's 26 years old. He's scared. But he called, which means he's already made most of the decision. Elias thought about that. He thought about what it cost a young deputy to pick up the phone and call the attorney for the man his colleague had arrested, and what it would cost him father to actually sit down and say it out loud where it could be recorded and used. When can you meet with him? Monday morning if he agrees. Make it happen, Elias said. The Alderman Coalition held their press conference without him on Sunday. He watched it on his laptop at the kitchen table, 12 minutes of cameras and microphones outside the Ashford Hills County Courthouse. The coalition spokesperson, named Vera Drummond, delivering a prepared statement that was accurate in its facts and powerful in its framing, and that made Elias feel watching it. A man observing his own biography being assembled by people who hadn't asked him what he wanted the chapters to say. They used the words hero and warrior more than he was comfortable with. They talked about his service record with a reverence that he understood was intended to underscore the injustice this happened to a Medal of Honor recipient. So imagine what happens to everyone else. And he understood the logic. He did that. The logic still bothered him in a specific way he couldn't entirely articulate. It felt like the argument was he deserved better because of what he'd done. And the argument he actually wanted to make was simpler and more uncomfortable. Everyone deserves better regardless. Acted Fitch. They used my service record as the frame. She texted back. It's not wrong, it's just not complete. That's the problem. Yes, you'll get to make your own frame. Patient. He put the phone down and went back to watching. Eyes. Avira Drummond was taking questions. A reporter near the front asked whether Elias Carter planned to file civil litigation, and Drummond said that was a matter for his legal counsel, which was technically true and diplomatically efficient. Hines. Another reporter asked about General Reed's involvement, and Drummond handled it, well acknowledged. It declined to make it the center of the story, moved on. Last question. From a woman near the back of the crowd, whose face Elias couldn't make out clearly through the laptop screen, was the one that hit hardest. What does this case mean for other people who've experienced similar stops in Ashford Hills County, but don't have a 4-star general to call? Drummond paused for a full 2 seconds before answering. That, she said, is the exact question this case needs to answer. Deputy Aaron Prosser arrived at Fitch's temporary office in Ashford Hills, a borrowed conference room in a law firm on Callaway Street on Monday morning at 9. He came in civilian clothes, which meant he'd either taken a personal day or been put on administrative leave, and from the look of him, 26 thin, with the slightly underwater expression of someone who hadn't been sleeping, Elias suspected the latter. Elias wasn't in the room. Fitch had been clear about, with the presence of the man whose case this directly concerned, because a witness statement taken with the subject present had evidentiary complications she didn't want. Elias sat in the waiting area outside with a cup of coffee that had gone cold and a copy of the Ashford Register that he wasn't really reading. He could hear the low murmur of voices through the conference room wall. Words. Just the rhythm of a conversation that started careful, and then after about 20 minutes became something more urgent. The meeting lasted an hour and 14 minutes. When Fitch came out, she closed the door behind her and stood in the waiting area doorway. Her expression was the controlled professional one she wore, when the information she was carrying was significant enough that she didn't want her face to do the work before her words did. She kept notes. She said Elias looked at her personal notes. In a private journal. He kept at home, not connected to the department. Dating back 18 months, she came into the waiting area and sat in the chair beside him, lowered her voice out of habit even though the hallway was empty. Documented 7 incidents. 7 stops conducted by Vaughn that Prosser either responded to or heard about directly. 5 of those incidents. Vaughn's official report contained information that Prosser witnessed as inaccurate. In 3 of them, Prosser says he raised questions internally and was told by his supervising sergeant, not Mercer directly, a sergeant named Dale Whitfield, that Vaughn's reports were reviewed and the matter was closed. Whitfield told him to drop it. In 2 of those conversations, Whitfield used the phrase "not your business" or a variation of it. Fitch folded her hands in her lap. Conversation. Whitfield told Prosser that filing a complaint against a senior deputy was the kind of thing that ended careers. The waiting room was very quiet. "Where's Prosser now?" Elias asked. "Nice. Still inside. He's reviewing his statement with a personal attorney. I told him to call one before he signed anything, which he did." She arrived about 40 minutes and Fitch paused. "He's going to cooperate fully. He's terrified, but he's going to do it. He protected whistleblower protections will apply once he submits formally to the DOJ investigation." A file simultaneously. She looked at him steadily. "This is no longer a misconduct case. What Prosser describes is a deliberate institutional suppression of complaints. That's a different category. How different, the kind that ends with people in rooms they didn't expect to be in." The DOJ investigators arrived in Ashford Hills on Wednesday. There were 4 of them, 2 attorneys from the Civil Rights Division, and 2 investigators who moved through the sheriff's office with the quiet, systematic thoroughness of people who had done this before and were not interested in making it comfortable for anyone. They set up in a conference room the department was legally required to provide, and they began working through the document production with a methodical efficiency that the department's outside counsel tried twice to slow and failed both times. Elias knew they'd arrived, because Fitch sent him a text at 8:14 a.m. They're in life. He was at the youth center when the message came, sitting in the small back office while Patricia Osei reorganized supply shelves in the next room, and the building settled into its morning quiet. He had come in early. Not because there was a session today, but because the center was the place where the problem had a human face, where Marcus Webb would walk through the door on Tuesday, and the other kids would come in carrying whatever version of the news they'd absorbed from their parents and their phones, and where Elias would need to have something honest and useful to say to them that didn't reduce into a slogan. He'd been working on what that would be, he didn't have it yet. Patricia appeared in the doorway. She was 53, Ghanaian American, with a particular direct energy of someone who had been running youth programs for 20 years and had stopped apologizing for her opinions somewhere around year 5. The DOJ is in the building? She asked. She'd been following the situation with the focused attention of someone who understood exactly what it meant for the kids she worked with. As of this morning. Good. She leaned against the doorframe. I had a parent call last night. His son is 15. He wants to know if you'd be willing to talk to his boy about what happened. What does the boy know about what happened? He knows what he saw online. Which means he knows the version that's been compressed into 90 seconds and 3 emotional beats. Patricia looked at him steadily. He needs the uncompressed version from you. Elias turned that over. He hadn't talked publicly about the stop in any direct personal sense, Fitch's instruction, which he'd followed, but there was a difference between public statements and private conversations with a 15-year-old who was trying to make sense of something. Tell his father to bring him Tuesday after the regular session. Patricia nodded, started to leave. Patricia, she turned. How are you holding up? She looked at him for a moment with a slight unreadable expression. I've been holding up my whole life, she said. I'm good at it. Then she went back to her shelves. The body camera footage problem surfaced on Thursday. Had claimed in his incident report and in subsequent statements to department counsel that his body camera had malfunctioned at the beginning of the stop. The camera log, which the DOJ investigators pulled along with everything else, showed that the device had been active at the start of the stop and had recorded approximately 4 minutes and 30 seconds of footage before the recording ended. The department's IT records showed the file had been marked as corrupted and flagged for deletion under the department's standard data management protocol. The DOJ investigators flagged it as something else entirely. Because while the body camera file at the Shefford Hills server had indeed been marked corrupted, the device itself, which had been submitted as part of equipment review following the incident, still contained a recoverable partition, not the full file fragments. Enough. Fitch called Elias at 11:40 a.m. on Thursday. They recovered footage, she said. He was driving. He pulled to the side of the road, not Millbrook Road, a different road, but the reflex was the same and sat. 2 minutes and 40 seconds of recoverable content. The investigators won't share the specifics of what's on it with me directly at this stage. But I have a source inside. The pause. The footage shows Vaughn on his radio before he initiated the stop. Before he turned on the lights, the implication landed before she finished saying it. He called in before he stopped me, Elias said. He appears to be describing your vehicle, make, model, and the driver's race before any traffic friction, real or fabricated. Before any basis for a stop existed, her voice was level but carrying something underneath it. That is not a stop based on erratic driving. That is a stop based on who was in the vehicle. Elias looked at the road ahead of him. A maintenance truck was parked on the shoulder, half a mile up its orange light, turning lazily. Everything else was still the marijuana claim, he said, as the resisting charge. All of it constructed after the decision to stop you was already made. Fitch let that sit for a moment. This is what we needed. This is the piece that moves it from misconduct to civil rights violation under federal statute. The dashcam showed what happened. This shows why it happened. What does this mean for Vaughn? Criminal exposure. Significant criminal exposure. Her voice was careful. Filing a false official report. Fabrication of evidence. And now this, which the investigators will frame as a pattern of racially motivated stops. He is no longer looking at termination in a civil settlement, Elias. He is looking at federal charges. The maintenance truck's orange light kept turning. St. Mercer. That depends on what the document review produces about the complaint closures. Whitfield telling Prosser to drop it. Mercer, signing off on the internal reviews. If the document showed that the sheriff knew the pattern and suppressed it, the exposure goes up the chain. She paused. This is going to move fast now. It moved faster than Fitch predicted. Friday morning, the Ashford Hills Register, which had broken the story and was now running it as a series, published a piece citing anonymous sources describing the recovered body camera footage. By noon, the AP had the story. By 2 p.m., the sheriff's office issued a terse statement saying they were cooperate fully with the federal investigation and had no further comment at this time, which satisfied nobody and inflamed everyone. By 3 p.m., Elias's phone showed 847 missed calls and he had stopped looking at it. He was at the center, sitting in the back office again. When Reed called on the landline, the center's main number, which meant the general had thought to call Patricia first and get routed through, which was itself a small piece of Reed's operational intelligence. "You're not answering your cell," Reed said. "I am not smart. How are you?" Elias leaned back in the chair, which creaked in the specific way that cheap office furniture creaks when it has carried a lot of weight over a long time. "I'm processing," he said. "There's a lot to process." "There is." A pause. "I want to tell you something, and I want you to hear it as information, not as pressure." Ahead. "The Pentagon reached out to my office this morning, not about the case, directly about you." Another pause. "Differs. There are people at very senior levels who are watching this, Elias. Not because you're a headline, because of what the headline represents. Friends in uniform and out, office members, who have been through versions of this and stayed quiet, because staying quiet felt like the only survivable option." Reed's voice had gone to the register he used when he was saying something he'd decided was important. "You didn't stay quiet and you didn't blow it up either. You just stood there and made the right calls in sequence." Elias didn't say anything for a moment. "I made the calls that were available to me," he said. "Right. That's what integrity looks like in practice," Reed said. "It doesn't look like the movie version. It looks like what you did." Outside the office door, he could hear Patricia moving around, the sound of a cabinet closing. It's a chair scraping. Normal sounds. The sounds of a place that existed for a specific purpose and kept existing regardless of what was happening in the wider world. Because the kids were still going to show up on Tuesday, Elias said. "When the investigation runs its course, and Fitch does. What Fitch does, I want to talk to you about something. Name it the settlement when it comes the money," he paused. I want to use it for something specific. I want your read on how to do it right." Reed was quiet for a moment. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking about Terrence Okafor and Dara Simmons," Elias said. "And about what happens to the people who go through this without a dash cam, without an attorney, without a general in their phone." Let the silence run for a beat. "Set up the meeting," he said finally. "I'll talk." The grand jury convened on the following Tuesday. Elias learned about it from Fitch at 7:52 a.m., 20 minutes before he was due to open the center for the morning session. He was in the parking lot of the center, sitting in his truck, when she called. "The U.S. Attorney's Office has convened a grand jury," she said. They moved faster than I expected. The recovered footage accelerated everything they had enough to present to a grand jury within a week of recovery, which tells you how clean the evidence is. How long does a grand jury take in a straightforward civil rights case with this quality of documentation? Days. Athens, maybe a week. She paused. "Vaughn's attorney has been in contact with the U.S. Attorney's Office. He's exploring a cooperation agreement. He wants to flip. He wants to reduce his exposure. Whether that means providing information about Whitfield, Mercer, or the broader practice, we'll know more soon." She said it neutrally, which was how she said things she had opinions about that weren't her place to voice. "How are you feeling?" "Steady," he said. "Good, because tomorrow there's going to be a press availability that I think you should attend. Not a press conference. I'm not putting you behind a podium. But a brief statement on camera in your own words. A controlled environment. Written questions submitted in advance, 2 minutes. Maximum a pause. The public narrative needs your voice in it right now. It's everyone else's voice." "What do I say?" "What you mean," she said. "You're good at that." He sat with it for a moment, looking through the windshield at the front door of the center, where Patricia was just arriving, keys in hand. The morning routine unchanged, by everything that was happening in the courtrooms and offices and newsrooms that was also simultaneously processing the name Elias Carter. "All right." He said. 2 minutes. Fitch said, "Mean every word." Get out of the truck. Marcus Webb was waiting on the bench outside the front door, arrived early again, backpack on his lap, looking at something on his phone. He looked up when Elias's shoes hit the pavement. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Mr. Carter. Marcus stood up straighter, the way teenagers do when they're trying to look less like teenagers. I wanted to come in before the session, I know," Elias said. He had been told Marcus would be there. He'd been thinking about what to say since Saturday. "Is it Marcus? Started again. Actually okay?" Elias looked at him, 16 years old, quick eyes, a geometry proof in his head that he'd written an apology for at the top, because nobody had ever told him he was good at this. Standing on a sidewalk outside a community center, trying to figure out how to ask the right question. Elias said, "Actually." "Okay." Marcus nodded, absorbing that. "Then they did it because you're black, not a question," Elias said, and staying calm, Marcus was working through it in real time, visible on his face. That was Like that was a choice, every single second. Single second, Elias confirmed. Marcus looked at his shoes for a moment. Aye. When he looked back up, his expression had shifted into something more settled, not resolved, because there was nothing resolved about it, but located. He'd found where the weight of the thing actually sat, and could now carry it properly. My mom asked me how I felt about it, he said. I didn't know how to explain it. What did you tell her? I told her I was proud of you, Marcus said. Also really, really angry. Elias looked at him for a long moment. That's exactly right, he said. Both of those things at once. Marcus nodded. Once the way certain people nod when something has been confirmed that they needed confirmed. He picked up his backpack and went inside. Elias stood on the sidewalk alone for a moment. His phone buzzed. He glanced at it, a message from Fitch's paralegal, a subject line that made his chest go still. Grand jury update, call when available. He looked at the message. He looked at the door Marcus had just walked through. He put the phone back in his pocket and walked inside. The call could wait 4 minutes. The session started at 8, and 16 kids were about to walk through that door who needed to see him standing at the front of the room, like he belonged there, not as a headline, not as a symbol, but as the person who showed up on Tuesday mornings, because showing up was what you did. He had the call at 8 far, stepping out the back while Patricia ran the opening. Fitch's paralegal, a young woman named Kara, who communicated with the efficiency of someone trained by Sandra Fitch, delivered the update in 40 seconds. The grand jury had returned an indictment overnight, faster than any of them had anticipated. Derek Vaughn was being charged with deprivation of rights under color of law, filing a false official report and obstruction of justice. A warrant had been issued. Vaughn had been taken into custody at his residence at 6:43 a.m. And Sheriff Caleb Mercer, according to information Kira conveyed with the careful neutrality of someone reading from a note, had been subpoenaed to appear before the grand jury by end of week, and the U.S. Attorney's Office had notified the county that Mercer's continued service as sheriff, while under active federal subpoena, represented a conflict sufficient to require his immediate administrative suspension. Elias stood in the alley behind the Riverside Youth Center. He stood there for a long moment, then he went back inside. He was at the front of the room when the first kid walked through the door, and the second and the third, until all 16 of them were seated and looking at him, some of them knowing, some of them not yet, all of them young enough that what happened in the next several years would determine how they understood the relationship between power and accountability for the rest of their lives. Elias looked at them. He opened his mouth to begin. And then his phone on silent in his pocket began to vibrate with a pattern of rapid pulses that meant multiple incoming calls, arriving simultaneously, which was the pattern it had made every day since Friday, would been successfully ignoring. But this time, when Patricia, standing at the side of the room, glanced at her own phone and then at him, her expression was not the usual managing the news cycle expression. It was something different, something that made him cross to her in 3 steps and take the phone she was already holding out to him. And when he looked at the screen, what he saw was a name he recognized, not Fitch, not Reed, not Kira, but a name that had no business being in this story. A name connected to a part of none of them had reached. Yet, a name that belonged to the Office of the United States Attorney for the Eastern District of North Carolina, eyeing him directly. Not through Fitch, not through Reed. He looked at the kids. He looked at the phone. Give me 2 minutes, he said to Patricia. She nodded. He walked back outside into the alley, and when he answered, the voice on the other end said 4 words that reframed everything that came next. We need your S, attorney said. And we need it on the record before Friday. Her name was Claudia Voss. Elias had looked her up 2 days ago, when her name first appeared in Fitch's Briefing's Eastern District. 12 years in federal prosecution, a record on civil rights cases that was unusual for someone who hadn't made it a specialty. She hadn't made it a specialty. She'd just been good at it when the cases came across her desk, which was a different kind of credential. An attorney should be on this call, Elias said. I've already spoken with Miss Fitch this morning. She's aware I'm calling. She agreed that a direct conversation was appropriate given the timeline. A brief pause. The grand jury indicted Vaughn overnight. What you don't know yet is that Vaughn's cooperation agreement, which his attorney has been negotiating since Wednesday, collapsed at 11 p.m. last night. Elias stood in the alley behind the center and said nothing, waiting. He decided not to cooperate, Voss said, which means the case against Mercer and Whitfield moves forward without his testimony. Which means we need yours to be comprehensive, documented, and delivered before the window closes on the grand jury's current session. She spoke without urgency, but with the density of someone compressing important information efficiently. I'm not asking you to do something you weren't already going to do. I'm asking you to do it faster. How fast, Thursday? Fuckers. 2 hours my office in Raleigh. Through the back door of the center, he could hear Patricia's voice starting the morning session, clear, organized, practical, the voice of someone who had been holding things together for a long time. 16 kids sitting in chairs beginning their Tuesday. I'll be there, Elias said. Thank you. Voss paused, and in the pause he heard something calibrate slightly, a professional assessment completing itself. Mr. Sergeant Carter, for what it's worth, the way you handled the initial stop is why this case is as clean as it is. Most cases arrive with complications. Yours arrived with a dash cam, a general, and a man who stayed within the law even when the law was being used against him. That matters in a courtroom. What matters to me, Elias said, is that it stops. Right. That's what we're trying to do, she said, and the call ended. Fitch arrived at the center at noon. She sat across from Eli in Patricia's office. Patricia had relocated to the main room without being asked, with the tact of someone who understood space and time, and walked him through Thursday's testimony preparation with the methodical thoroughness she applied to everything. They went over the timeline of the stop in precise sequence. They covered his behavior at each point, requests, on responses, the search, a arrest. They covered the phone call to Reed. They covered the evidence bag, the metal, the ride to the station, intake process. One point, Fitch stopped and looked at him. You're not nervous, she said. It wasn't quite a question. I've testified before, he said. Congress. Twice, once in a military tribunal. This is different. Fine. No, he looked at his hands on the table, but the facts are simple. I didn't do anything wrong. I just have to describe what happened to me in order without editorializing. He paused. If the hardest part of that is the editorializing instinct. But what would the editorial be? He thought about it. I knew. The moment he turned on the lights, what this was. I didn't know his name or his record or his history. But I knew what the stop was, and I knew it because I've known it my whole life, and there is something deeply, specifically exhausting about knowing something like that, and having to perform uncertainty about it, so that nobody accuses you of being the problem. He stopped. That's the part I won't say in the grand jury room. Fitch agreed quietly, but say it somewhere. Eventually, I'm working on it, he said. Hans' mugshot appeared in the Ashford Register on Wednesday morning. He looked like a man who had not slept in 4 days, which he probably hadn't. Awful. Carried the specific flattening quality of arrest photography, no angle, no context, just a face in front of a measured grid, a placard with a case number, a date. He looked smaller than he had on Millbrook Road. That was the strange thing Elias noticed, looking at the image for a moment before he closed the browser tab. Diminished by consequences, just physically smaller. The way people look when the scaffolding of authority is removed and you're left seeing the actual person underneath. The register story accompanying the photo was detailed and sourced. All charges. The specific stat, a timeline of the complaint closures. Since Prosser's whistleblower filing, which had become public record. Sidebar, on Terence Okafor and Dara Simmons, both of whom had agreed to be interviewed cautiously with their own attorneys present, and both of whom described stops, that now in the context of the federal record, it's like isolated incidents and more like a methodology. Okafor's interview was 7 paragraphs. In the 4th paragraph, he said, I filed the complaint because I thought somebody would do something about it. And then they closed it, and I had to figure out how to explain to my son what that meant. I didn't have good words for it. Elias read that paragraph 3 times. He thought about Marcus Webb and geometry proofs. He thought about what it cost a man to try the system through the available channels and have the system look at his complaint and say, essentially, we reviewed it, and it doesn't count. He thought about the word Okafor used to explain the specific burden of having to explain to a child, the gap between how institutions claim to work and how they actually work, without teaching the child to either give up or explode. He wrote Okafor's name in the margin of his legal pad next to Simmons's name, which he'd written there 2 days ago. Then he went back to his testimony preparation. The U.S. Attorney's Office in Raleigh occupied the 7th and 8th floors of a federal building on New Bern Avenue, a building that had the particular institutional gravity of places where the government's authority was, exercised with paperwork and precision rather than force. Elias arrived on Thursday at 9 a.m. 15 minutes early, wearing a dark suit he'd last worn at a memorial service 2 years ago. It fit the same. He was that kind of person. Fitch met him in the lobby. Boss is good, she said as they rode the elevator up. Ask clean questions, answer. If something is outside what you directly witnessed or experienced, say so. I know how to testify. I know you do. I say it to everyone. The elevator opened. The grand jury room itself was not dramatic. It never was a rectangular space, a seated jury of 23 citizens in tiered rows, a stenographer, a witness chair, the U.S. attorney. At a table with 2 assistants, no opposing counsel, because grand jury proceedings didn't work that way. I budge. Just the question of whether the evidence presented was sufficient to charge. I sat in the witness chair. He testified for 1 hour and 53 minutes. He described each moment in sequence, the lights in the rear view, the approach, the request for documents, the escalation of questioning, the search, the destruction of the materials, the metal, the arrest. He described it in the flat, specific language of someone recounting events, not performing them, and the flatness was its own kind of indictment, because it left no room for interpretation. The jurors were watching him the way people watch, when they're trying to decide something, and he let them watch. And he answered every question Voss asked him with the same precision he'd applied on Millbrook Road, careful, compliant, present, not giving the room anything it hadn't asked for. Voss played the dashcam footage. She played the recovered body camera fragments. She asked him to identify on the body camera footage the moment when Vaughn's radio transmission began and what was visible in the frame at that point. Bias looked at the image on the screen, his truck parked legally, driving at legal speed, and said, "That's my vehicle." There is nothing wrong with how it's moving. He said it without emphasis, and it didn't need any. When it was over, he walked out of the building into the September afternoon and sat on a concrete bench outside the entrance and did nothing for about 4 minutes. Josh breathed. The sun was coming through the office towers at the angle it came through in mid-morning, and the street noise of Raleigh was exactly what street noise was, not significant, not symbolic, just the sound of a city going about its business. Fitch came out and sat beside him. "You were good in there," she said. "We're the juror. I've been doing this for 16 years, she said. They were good. The grand jury returned a second indictment 4 days later, named Sergeant Dale Whitfield on 2 counts obstruction of justice and conspiracy to deprive civil rights. The indictment was specific and damaging. It cited by date and content the 2 conversations Prosser documented in his personal journal, including the specific phrase, "not your business," and the warning about careers. Prosser's journal had been entered into evidence with the notarized certification of a handwriting expert who confirmed the entries were contemporaneous with the dates, marked not written after the fact. Whitfield was placed on administrative leave by the county commission within an hour of the indictment being filed. Not fight the leave. Sheriff Mercer appeared before the grand jury on Friday. He arrived with 2 attorneys, which was the numerical indicator of how seriously his own counsel was taking the situation. He was in there for 3 hours and 20 minutes. When he came out, his face carried the particular grayness of a man who had answered questions he didn't want to answer, because the alternative, invoking his Fifth Amendment right in front of a federal grand jury, would have been its own statement, its own record, its own career conclusion. The Ashford Register had a photographer outside the building. The photograph ran on Saturday's front page. Mercer on the federal building steps, head slightly down, the 2 attorneys flanking him, the gray midday light flattening everything to its essential shape. The photograph. The headline read, "Sheriff testifies in federal civil rights investigation. Second indictment issued." Bias saw the photograph on his phone at the center Saturday morning, while he was setting up for the weekly community session. He'd added to the schedule 3 days ago in response to requests from parents who wanted a space to talk through the case with their kids present. He looked at the photograph for a moment, then set his phone face down on the table and continued setting up chairs. Patricia came in from the supply room carrying a box of notebooks. "Did you see it?" "Yes." She set the box down. "How do you feel?" He considered it honestly, like it's not done yet. She agreed. "But it's going, he said. The civil settlement negotiation began the week after Mercer's grand jury appearance. Fitch sat across from the county's outside counsel, a firm from Charlotte that the county commission had retained after their regular counsel, withdrew citing conflict of interest, and opened with a number that made the attorneys go very still for about 3 seconds. The number was not punitive for its own sake. It was calculated. Legal fees demonstrated economic harm, compensatory damages, and a forward-looking component that accounted for the pattern of harm documented in the federal investigation. Had a spreadsheet. She had case precedents. She had the body camera footage and the dash cam footage and Prosser's journal and Okafor's complaint and Simmons' complaint, and she had the indictments, which were not evidence of civil liability but were very effective at establishing a contextual backdrop. The county's attorneys asked for 2 weeks to respond. Fitch gave them one. Elias was not in the room for any of those negotiations, which was how Fitch preferred it. He was told the broad strokes each evening in a 15-minute phone call, and he listened and asked practical questions and let her work. He trusted her, not because she'd been recommended to him, though she had been, but because he'd watched her operate for 2 weeks and understood what she was doing and why she was doing it in the order she was doing it. She didn't perform competence, she just was it, which was rarer than people thought. What Elias was doing, while Fitch negotiated, was less dramatic and more necessary. He was talking to people he called Terence Okafor on a Tuesday. They spoke for 40 minutes. Okafor was guarded at first, understandably, given what had happened the last time he'd engaged with any kind of process, but he was also angry in the specific, durable way of someone who had been angry for 18 months and hadn't found a place to put it. At the end of the call, they'd agreed to meet in person the following week. He called Dara Simmons on a Wednesday. Her situation was different from Okafor's. She'd moved out of Ashford Hills County after the stop, relocated to Durham, found work was rebuilding. She didn't want to be a central figure in anything, she said. She just wanted to know that what had happened to her was in the record. Elias told her. But she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Good. That's okay. Good." And he heard in the gap between those words the particular exhausted relief of someone who had spent over a year carrying something alone. He also called Marcus Webb's mother, not about the case, to check in. She answered on the second ring and told him Marcus had been staying up late, reading about the case online, and writing something she didn't know what. He wouldn't show her, and that he'd asked her twice if people who did wrong things ever actually faced real consequences, or if that was just something adults said. "How did you tell him?" Elias asked. "I told him sometimes they do," she said. "And that the times they do, it's because someone stayed in the room and kept telling the truth." "That's a good answer," Elias said. "It's your answer," she said. "I borrowed it." The county's attorneys came back in 8 days, not 10, which was itself information. They came back with a counteroffer that was 40% below Fitch's opening number, structured in a way that suggested they understood the basic framework was correct. They were negotiating scope, not premise. Fitch responded in 48 hours. The Charlotte attorneys responded in 36. The third exchange happened in a single day, a series of calls and emails that Fitch described to Elias that evening as productive in the uncomfortable way that productive things usually are. On the Thursday of the second week, she called him at 6 p.m. "I've accepted a figure," she said. He was at his kitchen table eating reheated rice and watching the evening come in through the window. "Figure," she told him. It was not the number she'd opened with. It was not the number they'd countered with. It was a number that occupied a specific position between those 2 points, closer to hers than to theirs, which was where it needed to be. More than he'd expected when this started, enough to do something real with. "There are conditions," Fitch said, mandatory cameras on all patrol officers department-wide. An independent civilians oversight board with actual investigative authority, not advisory investigative. Automatic external review of any traffic stop complaint filed by a driver identifying racial bias, with the review conducted by the state's Office of Civil Rights rather than internally. She paused, and a formal public acknowledgement by the county commission that the pattern of conduct documented in the federal investigation constituted civil rights violations. "That last one," Elias said. "I know," Fitch said. "I fought it hardest." "It's in," he set his fork down. Elias. Her voice had shifted slightly, not warmer exactly, but less precise, in the way that people allow themselves to be when the professional transaction is complete and there's a human moment left. "This is a significant outcome for what that's worth coming from me." "It's worth a lot," he said. "Coming from you after the call." He sat at the table for a while without eating. His phone was face up on the table. He looked at the contact list, Reed, Fitch, Patricia, Okafor, Webb, and he thought about the shape of what he wanted to do next, which had been forming in his mind for 2 weeks, and was now clear enough to begin building. He was not keeping this, not the money, not the story, not the outcome. None of it was designed for him alone, and he'd known that from the moment on Millbrook Road when he made the calculation and picked up the phone. He opened a note on his phone and started writing things down. The Riverside expansion, Okafor and Simmons, and whoever else was out there with a closed complaint and nowhere to go. Scholarships. His mother had never gotten the education she'd wanted, had given everything she had to making sure he could access what she couldn't, and there was something that needed to be named after her. Something that showed up, he wrote for 20 minutes. Then he called Reed. The general answered on the first ring, which was unusual. "I'm ready to have that conversation," Elias said. No, Reed said. Fitch called me 30 minutes ago. Eyes. Of course she did. She's thorough. A pause that carried something warm in it. Elias. Tell me what you're thinking. Elias looked at his notes. I'm thinking about a legal support fund, specifically for people in this region who experience documented civil rights violations during traffic stops and can't access adequate representation. Something with intake capacity, a referral network, sliding scale, and pro bono partnerships. He paused. And I want to bring Okafor and Simmons into the design process, not as recipients. As co-designers, Reed was quiet for a moment. That's the right call, he said. And the scholarship's named for your mother, Reed said quietly. Yes. Another pause. She would have been impossible about this, Reed said. Best way. She would have been at that station before you were, Elias said. And she'd have had things to say that nobody was ready for. Laughed. A real one, short and full, then it settled. I can put you in contact with 3 foundations that do this kind of infrastructure work, Reed said. And there's a legal clinic model out of Durham. I think you should look at. They've built exactly the intake system you're describing. They just lack the reach. I want to meet with them. I'll make the call Monday. They talked for 20 more minutes, working through the structure of it, the way 2 people work through something when they've both thought about it independently and arrived at compatible conclusions. It was practical and specific and not emotional in a visible way, which was its own kind of emotional. After the call, Elias washed his dinner dish, eyed it, put it away. He stood at the kitchen window for a moment in the evening quiet. And then his phone buzzed with a news alert from the register, a push notification, 4 words, and a headline that he read twice before setting the phone face down again. A headline read, Mercer resigns commission to appoint interim sheriff. He'd expected it. He'd known it was coming since Mercer's grand jury appearance, probably earlier than that. But there was a difference between expecting something and having it arrive, between knowing a thing intellectually and feeling the specific complicated weight of it actually landing. Outside, the street was quiet. A neighbor's porch light was on 2 houses down. Somewhere further off, a car was moving slow through the residential grid, its headlights sweeping across the tree line in a steady, unremarkable arc. Nothing. In the view was dramatic. That was the thing about consequences. They rarely looked dramatic from the outside. They looked like a news alert. They looked like a man leaving a building with 2 attorneys. They looked like a mugshot. They looked like the ordinary continuation of ordinary life, with the difference that underneath that ordinary continuation, something had been irrevocably altered. Himself feel it. Not triumph, not relief exactly. Something more complicated than either the feeling of a process having moved in the direction. It should move a cost that was real and distributed unevenly and would not be fully tallied for a long time. He felt the weight of Okafor's 40-minute call, and Simmons' guarded voice and Marcus Webb staying up late writing something he wouldn't show his mother. He felt the weight of his mother's name, which would now be attached to something in the world. He stood there until the feeling passed through him and settled into something quieter. Then he went to his desk and began drafting the outline for the fund. He worked for 2 hours. At 11 p.m. a text came from Fitch. One more thing. Vaughn's attorney filed a motion to suppress the body camera fragments. Judge Harlan takes it Monday if the motion succeeds. Read the message. Read it again. He set the phone down on the desk next to his outline and looked at what he'd written: the fund, the scholarships, the co-design process, the legal clinic partnership, the names of people he owed something to in the margin at the top of the page. He looked at the phone. If Harlan suppressed the body camera fragments, the cleanest piece of evidence connecting Vaughn's stop to racial targeting went away. Not the dash cam, not Prosser's testimony. But the fragment that showed Vaughn on his radio before the lights. Went on the fragment that turned an incident of misconduct into documented premeditation. That piece, if it went away, changed the shape of everything. Voss had built the case to survive without it, but built to survive without it was not the same as built to win without it. Elias stared at the phone for a long moment. Then he picked it up and typed back, "What time does Harlan's clerk open Monday?" Came in 40 seconds, 8 a.m. He looked at his outline. He looked at the notes in the margin: Okafor, Simmons, Webb, his mother's name at the top. Because if the motion succeeds and the fragments are suppressed, we need to be ready to move immediately on the civil side. I want everything in place before Monday morning. What do we still need? Passed, then Fitch sent a list. It was 8 items long. Item 7. The one that made Elias sit back in his chair and look at the ceiling for a moment before coming back to the screen was something neither of them had discussed yet. Something that had been sitting at the edge of the case for 3 weeks, referenced in passing in the DOJ document production, but never made central, never addressed directly. Because buried in the 5 years of traffic stop records, the DOJ had subpoenaed from the sheriff's office were files that predated Vaughn's time at the department records that bore a different name, a different badge number, a different era, a pattern so similar to Vaughn's that it was either coincidence or inheritance. And the name on those older records was not Vaughn. It was not Whitfield. It was not Mercer. It was a name Lias had encountered before. In this case, a name that appeared in the department's archives in a role that no longer existed under that title, in a period that predated every complaint that had ever been filed and closed, in a position that would have given its holder direct supervisory authority over every deputy in the department for 6 years. Item 7 on Fitch's list read, "We need to know who trained Vaughn." The name was Raymond Coyle Elias, found it the same way Fitch had found it buried in the document production, in a section of personnel records that the sheriff's office had technically complied with producing and practically buried by surrounding it with 800 pages of routine administrative paperwork. Her paralegal Kira had pulled the full file by Sunday morning and emailed it to both of them at 7:53 a.m. with a subject line that said only read before Monday. Raymond Coyle had served as training and procedures supervisor for the Ashford Hills County Sheriff's Office from 2009 to 2015. The title was institutional language for the person responsible for onboarding new deputies, setting department conduct standards, and delivering the formal instruction that shaped how officers understood their authority and its limits. He had trained every deputy hired during those 6 years. Derek Vaughn had been hired in 2012. Coyle had retired voluntarily in 2015, full pension, commendation letter signed by Mercer, a brief mention in the county newsletter. He currently lived in Beaufort, North Carolina, 40 minutes from Ashford Hills. He was 61 years old, his traffic strength from his time as a patrol deputy, which predated his supervisory role, showed 11 documented stops over 4 years in which the subject's race was noted in the incident report in a way that was not required by department procedure. We notated race if it was relevant to the stop. Of Coyle's reports. It was notated, and in none of those reports was there a discernible reason why it needed to be. 8 of the 11 stop drivers were black, 3 were Latino. None of the stops resulted in charges that were prosecuted. None had generated formal complaints that survived internal review. Because Coyle had been for 3 of those years on the internal review panel, Elias read the file at his kitchen table on Sunday morning with coffee that went cold beside him. He read it twice. "I've read it," he said. "I know it's Sunday. Who else has this? The DOJ investigators have the same production we have. Whether they've connected it yet." She paused. "I'm going to assume they have." "These are federal investigators, but I'm not waiting on their timeline." "What are you doing?" "I'm filing a supplemental brief with the U.S. Attorney's Office this afternoon that draws the Coyle connection explicitly. Us needs to see this before Monday's suppression hearing, because if Harlan does suppress the fragments, we want the broader pattern argument already in the record as an alternative evidentiary foundation." She was talking at the pace she used when she was 3 moves ahead and wanted to make sure he could see what she was seeing. The fragments showed Vaughn's specific conduct. The Coyle records show where that conduct came from. They're separate evidentiary threads, but they reinforce each other. And Coyle himself. He's a private citizen now. He can't be subpoenaed in the civil case without a showing of relevance, which we now have a pause. The DOJ can subpoena him in the criminal investigation. If they move on it, will they? I think when they see the supplemental brief, Fitch said, they'll move on it. She was right. Judge Harlan's courtroom on Monday morning was the kind of room that had heard 1,000 ordinary arguments and had the acoustics of institutional patience. High-ceiling wood paneling, gone dull with age, fluorescent lights, softened by fixtures that dated from a renovation sometime in the early 90s. Elias was not present for the suppression hearing. He sat in the hallway on a bench outside the courtroom door, in the same dark suit, hands loosely folded, while inside Vaughn's attorney argued that the body for fragments had been recovered through a process that violated chain of custody protocols and should be suppressed as tainted evidence. Voss's team was inside. Elias waited. He was not alone in the hallway. Prosser sat 2 benches down in civilian clothes, waiting to be called as a potential witness on the chain of custody question. They had nodded to each other when Prosser arrived. They hadn't spoken. Prosser was looking at the floor with the expression of someone who had made an irrevocable choice, and was now living inside the consequences of it, which was its own kind of courage, the unglamorous kind, the kind that didn't come with salutes. Off. The hearing lasted 2 hours and 11 minutes. When the courtroom door opened and Fitch walked out, her face told him before she did. "I'd," she said. She sat on the bench beside him. Island. Found the recovery process sound the fragments stay in. Yes. Let out a breath, just one controlled. Vaughn's attorney is going to appeal, she said. Let them appeal. It will take time, everything takes time, he said. That's fine. Fitch looked at him sideways. You're very calm for someone who just got very good news. I've been calm this whole time, he said. It's the only thing that's worked. The supplemental brief went to Voss's office at 9 a.m. She called me during the recess. The DOJ investigators are already looking at Coyle's records. She paused. Elias. It's moving, Elias, I know. He stood up, straightened his jacket, and looked down the hallway toward the building's main entrance, where morning light was coming through the glass doors in long rectangles across the floor. Acres. Somewhere in that building, the machinery of accountability was turning slowly, unevenly, with all the friction that machinery accumulates over years of misuse but turning. What's next? He asked. The civil settlement finalizes Wednesday. And then she hesitated, which Fitch almost never did. There's a request I've been holding for a week because the timing wasn't right. Now. He looked at her. The Senate Judiciary Committee, she said. They've opened a hearing on civil rights enforcement and police accountability. Testimony from affected individuals. She met his eyes. They ask for you specifically, not as a symbol. As someone who can speak to the systemic mechanics of what happened, the complaint suppression, the institutional training failures, the gap between what the law provides and what people can access. He was quiet for a moment. 3 weeks, Washington. He thought about Okafor saying, I filed the complaint because I thought somebody would do something about it. He thought about Simmons's voice, guarded, exhausted, relieved, when he told her it was in the record. He thought about item 7 on Fitch's list and what it meant that a man named Coyle had spent 6 years teaching younger officers what authority looked like and how to use it. That the lesson he'd passed down had made its way into the cuffs on Millbrook Road. Yes, Elias said. The civil settlement finalized on Wednesday afternoon. Elias signed the documents at Fitch's office in a room that smelled of old coffee and printer ink, with Fitch across the table and Kara notarizing and the county's Charlotte attorneys present in the specific Athens, muted way of people who were professionally obligated to be somewhere they'd rather not be. The county commission's formal acknowledgement that the pattern of conduct documented in the federal investigation constituted civil rights violations had been drafted, reviewed, approved, and was scheduled for public reading at the next commission meeting. The number on the settlement agreement was real. Looking at it was strange, not because of the amount, but because of what it represented. The county's formal assessment, expressed in the language of liability, that had been done to him, and to Okafor, and to Simmons, and to the others, whose names were in the complaint files, and the ones whose names weren't, because they'd never filed, never believed the filing would matter. He didn't feel like the money was his. It had never felt that way. He signed his name. The Charlotte attorneys left quickly. Had gathered the documents. Fitch poured herself a glass of water and sat across from him without the professional posture, for once just tired in the honest way of someone who had run hard for 3 weeks and was allowing themselves a moment to feel it. You should know, she said, that the Okafor and Simmons families will have separate civil claims that proceed independently. The county knows this. They've already retained counsel for those cases. She drank the water. To represent both of them, if they'll have me. I'll tell them, Elias said. I think they'll say yes. And you're serious about the design process. Aiton's bringing them in. I'm serious about everything, I said. She looked at him for a moment, with an expression that wasn't quite what he'd seen from her before, not the professional assessment, not the strategic calculation, but something more direct and human and unguarded. Why, she asked. Not why the fund, why this specific way. Co-designers, instead of beneficiaries. He thought about how to answer that. Because being helped without being consulted is its own kind of diminishment, he said. The system that failed Okafor and Simmons didn't just fail to protect them. It failed to see them as people whose judgment mattered. I'm not interested in reproducing that in a different key. Fitch was quiet for a moment. I'm going to steal that, she said. He said. Raymond Coyle was subpoenaed by the DOJ on the Thursday of that week. Learned about it from a brief text. From Fitch Coyle's subpoenaed appearance scheduled, and then from the Ashford Register's online edition, which had a reporter who had been following the DOJ thread closely and broke the Coyle story with enough detail to make clear that someone inside the process had decided the public should understand where this led. The story ran with Coyle's name, his title, his tenure dates, and a description of the traffic stop pattern in his personnel records. With a statement from the DOJ confirming an active investigation into department training practices. It ran with a photograph of Coyle that appeared to be from a county newsletter, a heavy-jawed man in his 50s with the flat departmental smile of someone being photographed for administrative purposes. The comment section of the Register's story, which Elias did not read, apparently ran to 400 responses within the first 3 hours. Elias did read, because Fitch forwarded it, was a statement from the Ashford Hills County Commission. In addition to the civil settlement terms, the Commission was announcing an independent audit of all department training materials used between 2009 and 2023 to be conducted by an external firm with no prior county contracts. Materials found to contain content inconsistent with constitutional standards would be removed and the findings made public. He read that twice, then he called Patricia. "Did you see the Commission statement?" he asked. "I did." Her voice was the particular warmth of someone who didn't express warmth casually, which meant when it came through it carried weight. Years of training materials. 14 years, he said. Not. That's a lot of deputies who learned something they should unlearn, she said. It's a lot of people on roads who deserved better, he said. She was quiet a moment. The parents from the Saturday session, 3 of them have asked me if the center can host a community forum about the case, specifically about what to tell their kids, how to have those conversations. A pause. I said I'd ask you. Tell them. Yes, he said, and tell them I'll be there. He flew to Washington on a Sunday. Reed met him at the airport, not because he'd arranged to, but because Reed was the kind of person who showed up at airports, who understood that logistics were how you expressed when the emotional vocabulary wasn't available. They drove into the city together in Reed's personal vehicle, not a government car, which was also its own kind of statement. They ate dinner at a restaurant near DuPont Circle that Reed apparently knew well, a small place unremarkable from side, with the kind of menu that changed seasonally and tables spaced far enough apart for a private conversation. Reed ordered without looking at the menu. Elias ordered the same thing and then changed his mind, which made Reed briefly genuinely amused. "How are you sleeping?" Reed asked. "Better than I was." Elias moved his water glass. "Great. But better the testimony tomorrow." "I'm ready for it." "I know. You're ready for it." Reed looked at him directly. I mean, how are you in it? This is a different kind of room than the grand jury. There will be cameras. There will be senators who want to use this, and senators who want to minimize it, and both of those will be performing for the same cameras. "I know how Senate hearings work," Elias said. "I know you do. I'm asking, because the question I want you to sit with tonight is not what you're going to say. You're saying it, because when the performing senators come at you from whatever angle they come at you." Reed paused. "I is the only thing that stays stable." Elias looked at his water glass. "I'm saying it. Because Terrence Okafor filed a complaint and it was closed," he said. "I'm saying it. Because Dara Simmons moved to another city." "I'm saying it. Because a man named Coyle spent 6 years teaching officers what authority looked like, and the version he taught was wrong, and nobody caught it until it showed up in a set of handcuffs on a gravel shoulder." He paused. "I'm saying it. Because Marcus Webb asked his mother if people who do wrong things ever face real consequences. And she told him sometimes they do if someone stays in the room and keeps telling the truth." Was quiet for a long time. "That's your why," he said finally. "That's my. Then you'll be fine tomorrow." The Senate Judiciary Committee hearing room was everything Reed had described and more, at angles Elias hadn't expected. Monitors in 2 elevated tiers behind the dais, some of them already managing their phones, some watching him with the focused attention of people who had read the briefing materials and cared about what they were going to hear. Staffers moving along the walls, gallery seats filled. He didn't look at the gallery directly, but he felt it, the specific weight of a room where the watching has consequence. Fitch was in the gallery. Reed was in the gallery. Patricia was in the gallery. She had driven 7 hours and was going to drive back the same day, which was the most Patricia thing he'd ever heard. He did not know if Okafor and Simmons were there. He hadn't asked. He'd told them both about the hearing, but left the attendant's decision entirely to them, which was the point. He sat at the witness table. He adjusted the microphone. He put his hands flat on the table in front of him, not gripped together, not performing composure, just flat. The committee chair, a senator from Oregon named Whitmore, opened the session with a 5-minute statement that Elias listened to without processing much of it. Because what he was doing was getting still in the specific interior way. That was the only preparation he had left to do. Then Whitmore, said Master Sergeant Carter, you may begin your statement. Elias looked up. He looked at the room, the cameras, and the senators, and the staffers, and the gallery, and the specific concentrated attention of a space that would carry whatever he said here into a record that would outlast this room this morning. This particular configuration of people trying to decide what accountability meant in practice. He spoke for 11 minutes. He did not use notes. He described the stop briefly not as grievance, but as the factual architecture of a systemic failure that required understanding to be fixed. He described the complaint process that had closed Okafor's file and Simmons' file. He described what it felt like to know that the system existed for reporting this and to understand simultaneously that the system was not designed in practice to receive what it claimed to receive. He described Raymond Coyle not by name because the DOJ investigation was ongoing and Fitch had been explicit about that boundary, but by function, by what a training supervisor's choices cascaded into over 6 years of hiring. He described Marcus Webb asking if wrong things ever faced real consequences. And then he said, I want to be direct about something because I think the tendency in these rooms is to frame cases like mine as extraordinary. I have a military record. I have a general walked into a police station for me. Those things are real, and I'm not dismissing them. But they are not a reason I deserve to be treated with basic dignity on Millbrook Road. He paused. He looked directly at the committee. I didn't need the Medal of Honor to deserve that. No one does. The extraordinary thing about my case is not what I am. What happened? When there was documentation, when there was accountability, and someone stayed in the room. Another pause. The question this committee has to answer is not what we do with the extraordinary cases. It's what we do for every Terrence Okafor who filed a complaint and got a closed file and had to explain that to his 12-year-old son. The room was very quiet. One of the senators, a man from Georgia named Pressler, who had been managing his phone when Elias started, had set the phone face down on the dais and was looking at him with an expression that was difficult to read and genuine. Whitmore thanked him. The questions ran for 90 minutes. 3 senators were performative in exactly the way Reed had predicted, and Elias handled them the way he'd handled the gravel shoulder calmly, specifically, without giving them anything they hadn't asked for, and without pretending the performance wasn't happening. 4 senators were serious and asked questions that required serious answers about the mechanics of complaint suppression, institutional training liability, and what federal enforcement capacity actually looked like on the ground. Senator, a woman from Michigan named Ferris, who had spent 12 years as a public defender before running for office, and whose questions had the specific grain of someone who had sat across from people ground up by exactly what Elias Lies was describing, asked him what. The most important structural change was the most visible. The most important, he didn't hesitate. Independent complaint review. He said not advisory boards. Investigative boards with subpoena power and mandatory external referral on pattern findings. Because the single point of failure in the Ashford Hills case was not one deputy on one road. It was a system that was allowed to review itself. Review is not review. Its insulation. Ferris wrote something down, and the hearing ended, and the room began to decompress, cameras lowering, senators gathering papers, the gallery releasing its collective held breath. Elias sat at the witness table for a moment and let the room change around him. He'd learned that about himself a long time ago. He was not a person who needed to be the first one out the door. Patricia was suddenly beside him, having moved from the gallery with the directness that was entirely characteristic of her. She did not say anything sentimental. She put her hand briefly on his shoulder, one firm, deliberate contact, and then she said, I'm driving back tonight. Marcus wants a full report by Wednesday. Tell him he'll have it, Elias said. Reed came next. He stood beside the table and looked at Elias for a moment. Reed said. I meant it. I know you did. That's why it landed. They shook hands, a real one, full grip, the kind between people who have seen each other at altitude and know what the other is made of. Reed held it a beat longer than necessary, which for a man of Reed's discipline was its own form of eloquence. I have something for you, Reed said. He reached into the breast pocket of his jacket and produced a folded piece of paper. It came to my office 2 days ago. I held it because I wanted to give it to you after, not before. Elias unfolded it. It was a letter handwritten on plain notebook paper, the handwriting slightly uneven in the way of someone who didn't write by hand very often. Mr. Carter. My name is Terrence Okafor. I watched your testimony from a conference room in my office because I couldn't get to Washington and I didn't want to miss it. I have a 9-year-old and a 14-year-old now. I told them both to watch my 14-year-old. He asked me why you stayed so calm when it was happening. I told him I didn't know. Maybe you could tell him yourself sometime. My number is at the bottom, Terrence. Elias read it twice. He folded it carefully and put it in his breast pocket. You need a ride to the airport, Reed asked. I'm taking the train, Elias said. I want the time. Reed nodded. He understood, had always been good at understanding the difference between space that needed filling and space that needed leaving. Thank you, Elias said, for the station, for tonight. All of it. Don't thank me for the station, Reed said. You'd earned that long before Millbrook Road, he paused. Thank me for the restaurant recommendation. That was genuinely good work on my part. It was the right note. Elias laughed, a real one, loose and brief, and it felt in the way that real laughter in serious places sometimes feels like something releasing that had been held a long time. 3 months passed. They passed the way months do when something significant has happened, and you are living inside its aftermath, not dramatically, not cleanly, but in the accumulation of specific days. Updates. Phone calls the fund's legal incorporation, which required 6 weeks of paperwork and 3 separate attorney reviews, and a meeting with the Durham Legal Clinic that ran 2 hours longer than planned and was better for it. Scholarship Foundation, which Elias named the Dorinda Carter Educational Fund, and which received its first 6 applications in the opening week from students in 3 counties. On's appeal of the suppression ruling was denied. When it came was 4 days the dashcam footage, body camera fragments. Prosser's testimony, delivered in a voice that shook slightly at the beginning and steadied by the 3rd question, covering 7 incidents documented in a private journal that the jury heard about in full. Kaffer's testimony. Simmons' testimony delivered by video link from Durham because she had decided she didn't want to return to Ashford Hills, and that was a decision no one argued with. Elias testified for 70 minutes on the 3rd day. He described Millbrook Road the same way he'd described it to the grand jury, flat, specific, in order. He described the metal. He described the moment the case went on the hood of the truck and the specific sound it made, which he hadn't planned to include, and which came out anyway because it was true, and because the truth of small sounds is sometimes what makes the larger truth audible. The jury deliberated for 6 hours, guilty on all 3 counts. When the verdict was read, the courtroom made the particular sound that courtrooms make, not loud, not celebratory, just the compressed exhale of a room that has been holding something for a long time and can finally set it down. Elias sat at the plaintiff's table and looked at his hands, and felt the specific, strange, inadequate relief of a process having concluded in the direction it should have concluded, knowing that the conclusion was right, and that it had cost more than it should have cost to get there, and that those 2 things existed simultaneously and would continue to. He thought about what Marcus Webb had written. He'd found out what it was. Marcus had shown him 3 weeks after the hearing, with the same mixture of pride and shielded vulnerability that he brought to everything. It was an essay, 4 pages, handwritten, titled "What Staying Means When Calm is the Only Weapon You Have." It was about Elias, but it was also clearly about Marcus himself, about what it meant to be 16 and black, and know certain things about certain rooms before you were old enough to have learned them through experience rather than inheritance. It was the best thing anyone had written about what had happened. Elias had asked if he could share it with Fitch. Marcus had looked at the floor for a moment and then said, "Does she actually read stuff people send her?" Elias said, "Okay." Marcus said, "But tell her I know it's rough in some places." Fitch had read it the same night and sent Marcus a handwritten note in response, 2 paragraphs, specific, not generic, which Marcus had photographed and set as the lock screen on his phone. Was sentenced 6 weeks after the verdict. 38 months in federal prison, permanent revocation of his law enforcement certification, lifetime ban from serving in any law enforcement capacity in any jurisdiction in the United States. Pleaded guilty to a reduced charge of obstruction and received 18 months suspended with 3 years probation and the permanent loss of his law enforcement credentials. Resigned and did not face criminal charges. The evidence of his direct knowledge of the pattern was circumstantial rather than documented, and the DOJ made a prosecutorial decision that reflected that evidentiary limitation. Lost his pension through a separate civil process that the county commission initiated after the commission audit revealed the depth of what had occurred under his administration. He moved out of Ashford Hills County 3 weeks after the Vaughn sentencing. Elias did not feel triumph about any of it. He felt something more durable than triumph, the specific, unspectacular satisfaction of a thing having been seen clearly and addressed imperfectly, but honestly by institutions that had initially tried to look away and had been prevented from looking away by documentation and persistence, and the choice made on a gravel shoulder on a summer evening to stay within the law even when the law was being weaponized against him. That choice had made the case clean. A messy case would have given everyone who wanted to look away a reason to look away. Not about that. A lot not with pride, because pride wasn't quite the right word for a calculation made under duress. But with the recognition that the specific decision to hand them, nothing had been the most important tactical choice he'd made, more important than any testimony, more important than any phone call. You can't build a case around a man who gave them nothing to work with. And Raymond Coyle was subpoenaed, testified before the federal grand jury, and was found to have knowingly included in department training materials between 2011 and 2014 language and procedural guidance that effectively authorized racial profiling under operational cover. He was not criminally charged. The legal threshold for criminal liability in training material content was complex, and the DOJ made a considered decision about prosecutorial resources. But the federal audit of his materials produced a 47-page report that was publicly released and that contained his name in its findings 7 times. The report was entered into the congressional record from Elias's hearing. It would be there permanently. That was its own kind of consequence. The community forum at Riverside happened on a Thursday evening in November, when the air had finally turned cool and the center's main room was filled past its usual capacity with folding chairs brought in from the storage room. Elias stood at the front and looked at the room, parents and teenagers, and a few kids too young to fully understand what they were there for, but old enough to understand that something important was being discussed, which was its own kind of education. He talked for 20 minutes not about the legal case, not about Vaughn or Mercer or the settlement. He talked about what it had felt like on Millbrook Road, the public version, not the testimony version, the real version. The specific cold clarity that had come over him, the calculation, the weight of knowing that every choice had a consequence, and that some consequences would fall on people who hadn't been on that road with him. He talked about his mother and what it meant to name something after her. Talked about staying calm, and what staying calm was not. It was not acceptance, not passivity, not the absence of anger. It was the decision to put the anger in a place where it could be used, rather than a place where it would be used against you. He talked about Marcus Webb's essay with Marcus's permission. 2 sentences from it. Calm is not the same as okay. Calm is what you use when okay isn't an option yet. The room was very quiet. Then the questions came, and they came for a long time. Parents asking about what to tell their kids, teenagers asking what they were supposed to do when the law was the thing being used against them. One woman in the back, who said she'd filed a complaint 4 years ago and never heard back and wanted to know if it was too late. And Elias wrote her name in his notebook and told her it was not too late and that he would connect her with resources before she left the building. He meant it. He did it. The Dorinda Carter Educational Fund gave out its first 12 scholarships in January. Elias was at the ceremony, a small one at the center, deliberately not dramatic, because the point was not the ceremony, but the thing the ceremony signified. Dorinda Carter's 22 years of second shifts at a textile plant in Denton had become through the specific and improbable chain of events that followed a stop on Millbrook Road, something that would put other people's kids through school. Her name was on something that lasted. He stood at the back of the room and watched the 12 students receive their letters, uncomfortable looking in the way that teenagers are at formal moments, sneaking glances at each other. A few of them with parents who were quietly crying in the way of people who understood the distance between where their family had been and where this envelope pointed. Marcus Webb was one of the 12. When Marcus's name was called, he walked to the front with his particular combinatist composure and imperfectly concealed emotion that was so distinctly, specifically him. He shook Elias's hand, a real handshake, prepared for it, full grip. And when he looked up, Elias saw in his the person he was going to be, not free of the knowledge that certain rooms would regard him with suspicion before he'd said a word, not free of the inheritance of what that meant and cost, but equipped, armed, with something more durable than either anger or acceptance, armed, with the understanding that staying in the room and telling the truth was a form of power that no one could issue and no one could revoke. Elias said. Marcus held the envelope. Is this real? He asked. He said it quietly, room, just for the 2 of them. It's real, Elias said. Marcus nodded, looked down at the envelope for a moment. And Back up, your mom would have liked this, he said. Elias looked at him. He hadn't told Marcus much about his mother, a few things in passing, over months of Tuesday sessions. That she'd worked hard, that she'd believed in him without requiring an audience for it. She'd given him the thing that no patrol car and no set of handcuffs and no false report could take away the knowledge bone deep and early, that his worth was not contingent on anyone else's recognition of it, Elias said. She would have died. Reed retired from the United States Army in February, 31 years after his commission. 5. Retirement ceremony was at Fort Bragg, a full military ceremony, as Reed's rank and record demanded, with the assembled honors of a career that had moved through conflict and command, and the specific binding work of keeping an institution accountable to its stated values. There were speeches, there were salutes, there was a flag. Elias was there. Before the ceremony, in a corridor off the main hall where the formal event had not yet reached its gravity, Reed found him, and they stood together for a moment, without the apparatus of rank or process between them, just two men who had known each other a long time, standing in a hallway before something ended. What are you doing next? Elias asked. Margaret has a list, Reed said. I suspect it involves a kitchen renovation and several arguments about tile. And after the list, Reed looked at him steadily. I've been asked to advise a policy working group on law enforcement accountability standards. Federal level. He paused. I told them I'd only do it if I could bring someone in who understood the ground-level experience from the inside. Elias looked at him. Are you asking me? He said. I'm informing you, Reed said. There's a difference. You already said yes, you just haven't heard the question yet. Laughed. It was the most sentence Reed had ever said. Elias laughed. On a Tuesday in March, he pulled into the Riverside Youth Center parking lot at 7:45 in the morning. The air was cold and clear, the kind of early spring morning that couldn't quite commit to being warm yet, but was trying. The center's lights were already on inside. Patricia always arrived first, always would, and through the front window, he could see her moving between the storage shelves in the organizational ritual that started every week. He sat in the truck for a moment. He thought about Millbrook Road the way he sometimes did in quiet moments, not as a wound, but as a reference point. The gravel under the tires, the lights in the mirror. The calculation he'd made in the cold clarity of the moment, and the long, uneven, imperfect chain of events that had followed it. The people who had filed complaints and been closed out. The people who had stayed quiet because staying quiet seemed survivable. The people who would come after all of Monroe's that were exactly like Millbrook Road in trucks, exactly like his, with the same inheritance and the same knowledge and the same impossible requirement to remain calm inside a system that was sometimes aimed directly at them. He thought about what he'd said in the Senate hearing room. No one needs a Medal of Honor to deserve basic dignity. He'd meant it entirely. He still meant it. He would go on meaning it in the specific way. You mean something you've paid for with your body and your patience and the particular exhaustion of being careful every second of every encounter with a system had been built in places to run on your exhaustion. The metal case was in his pocket. He'd started carrying it differently. Not hanging from the mirror, but in his jacket close. Not as a credential, not as a ward against whatever the next Millbrook Road produced, just as a fact. A record of a moment on a hillside in Helmand Province when he had made choices that other people survived, because he had understood in 30 seconds of chaos what mattered and what didn't. He knew what mattered. He walked to the front door. Inside, the first kid was already there, a 13-year-old named Deja, who had been coming for 3 weeks and who sat every session with the notebook. Elias had given her cracked open, writing things down, in a handwriting that slanted hard to the left, working something out in the margins of whatever he was teaching. That was clearly more important to her than the lesson itself. He'd asked her once what she was writing. She'd shown him a list in the margin of page 12 of things she was going to do when she was older. As long, it was specific. It had no apology at the top. Walked in. Deja looked up. You're early, she said. Sore, he said. She went back to her notebook. He set his jacket on the back of the chair at the front of the room, put his hands flat on the table. The same table, the same room, the same Tuesday morning rhythm that had continued through everything, because that was the point of it. Not the headlines, not the hearing rooms, not the settlements and the verdicts and the senator who wrote things down. Tired. Those mattered, they were necessary. But the point of all of it was this. The room, the kid with the notebook, the morning that kept coming regardless. He stood at the front of the room outside on Millbrook Road, and every road like it, the work was not finished. It would not be finished in his lifetime, probably. The machinery moved slowly and caught unevenly, and the gap between what institutions claimed to be and what they practiced in the dark and the gravel in the absence of witnesses was a gap that had to be closed one case, one record, one closed-door conversation redirected into daylight at a time. Life. He knew that he had always known that. He picked up the marker. He started the session. And the morning opened in front of him like the only thing it had ever been. The next thing, the one after that. Each of them small, and each of them necessary. Each of them the actual work, not the symbol of it, not the speech about it, but the thing itself done by a man who understood that dignity was not given by medals or confirmed by generals or validated by verdicts. It was practiced every day in ordinary rooms, by people who had decided that staying in the room was not the least they could do. It was the most